June 6, 1944, Normandy. The date is famous. The images are famous too. Waves, smoke, men pinned to the sand. But here's the twist. If your D-Day is basically saving Private Ryan, then you were shown 2 beaches out of 5. And a massive chunk of the actual landing force never really shows up on screen at all. On the morning of D-Day, around 83,000 British and Canadian troops came ashore in Normandy. That's more than the Americans at Omaha and Utah combined, which totaled about 73,000. And yet, in the pop culture version of history, a lot of people walk away thinking D-Day was an American operation with some British support floating around somewhere. That's backward. The support hit first in key places, secured the flanks, and took on the only major German armored counterattack of the day. So how did that happen? How do tens of thousands of Allied troops on the biggest day of the war in Western Europe basically vanish from the story most people remember? Before we even get into Hollywood, let's start with the people who had the least reason to exaggerate British and Canadian success: the Germans. Quick favor, if you're into Wood Lively stories that dig past the movie version and get into what really happened, hit like and subscribe. You'll get the next part of this story as soon as it drops. Now, picture this: Sword Beach, Normandy. Mid-morning, D-Day. A German officer watches the landing through a narrow slit, just a thin view of the beach, but enough to see the impossible happening. Years later, after the war, he's questioned by Soviet interrogators, and what he describes isn't a chaotic stampede. He describes something colder. He says the first wave moved through the beach obstacles like they owned the place. Not sprinting, not diving for cover every second. More like a steady push, as if the plan had already been decided and the beach just hadn't gotten the memo. German guns open up, machine guns, mortars, everything, and the line keeps moving. He's watching British troops of the 3rd Infantry Division come in on Sword Beach. This is where D-Day starts to look different when you zoom out. Normandy had 5 main landing zones: Sword, British; Juno, Canadian; Gold, British; Omaha, American; Utah, American; 3 British and Canadian beaches, 2 American beaches. And if you were taught D-Day through Big Hollywood, you probably saw the 2 American ones, and that was framed like it was the whole invasion. But on the German side, the map never looked like that. Go back one day, June 5th, 1944, German headquarters in the West. Senior commanders are staring at a coastline they've been fortifying for years, the Atlantic Wall stretching across Europe, and one name keeps pulling their eyes: Normandy. Specifically, the sector where British and Canadian forces are expected to land. German leaders don't assume the Allies will hit randomly. They try to predict where the best troops will land, where the biggest push will go, and what that push is trying to capture. And one city matters more than most on D-Day's first day: Caen. It's a road hub, a gateway inland. If you control Caen, you control movement, armor, supplies, reinforcements. It's also a key part of the German defensive line. On the invasion map, British and Canadian objectives are clear. On Sword, the British aim to drive inland toward Caen, around 9 miles from the beach. On Juno, the Canadians push toward major ground inland, including the area around Carpiquet Airfield, tied to the Caen fight. On Gold, the British aim to move off the beach fast and link up with Americans, while also securing zones connected to the future artificial harbor operations offshore. Now compare that to the American side. Utah had lower resistance and lighter casualties compared to Omaha. Omaha is the blood-soaked nightmare everyone remembers, but the numbers on D-Day tell a story that doesn't fit the movie poster. British and Canadian landings: about 83,000 troops on day 1. American landings: about 73,000 troops on day 1. Casualties? They're closer than people think. British and Canadian beaches, roughly 3,000 casualties that day. American beaches, roughly 3,400, with a huge share of that at Omaha. But raw casualty totals don't tell you the whole problem each force faced. For example, Utah landed off target on the wrong stretch of sand, but it worked out because it put American troops in a spot that was less heavily defended than planned. Sometimes mistakes save lives. On Sword, the British aren't getting a lucky break. They're driving toward one of the biggest prizes on the map, through prepared defenses, under pressure, with German armor sitting nearby. And the Germans know it. This is the part that matters. German planning isn't based on all Allied troops are the same. It's threat assessment, experience. Which divisions have been fighting for years and which ones are newer to this kind of war? By 1944, the British Army and Commonwealth forces have been in the fight since 1939. They've fought in North Africa, the Mediterranean, Italy. They've learned brutal lessons, sometimes the hard way, and they've adjusted tactics and equipment because of it. And the Germans have been watching. So where do they stack stronger defenses? Where do they expect a more professional landing? They put serious weight where they expect the biggest danger. And that danger, in their eyes, is the British and Canadian sector tied to Caen. But D-Day didn't start at dawn on the beaches. To see why the flanks matter and why German armor didn't get a clean shot at the invasion, you have to go earlier. Way earlier. The night of June 6th. Just after midnight, over Normandy, in darkness, 3 wooden gliders detached from their tow planes. No engines, no second pass, no go round, no try again. Once those tow ropes cut, the gliders are just silent, heavy arrows dropping toward France. Inside, around 30 men per glider, from D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, led by Major John Howard. Their mission isn't cause chaos, it's surgical. 2 bridges, one over the Caen Canal at Bénouville, the bridge the world later calls Pegasus Bridge, the other over the Orne River near Ranville. The math is simple. If those bridges aren't taken and held, German armor can roll in fast and punch into the eastern side of the beachhead. And if the beachhead gets split or crushed, the invasion can unravel. So the requirement is insane. Land within a short distance. Hit hard. Secure the bridges in minutes. Hold until relief arrives. The glider pilots trained for months for one shot in darkness. And then it happens. The first glider slams into the ground astonishingly close, just dozens of yards from the objective. The crash is violent. Men are thrown forward, gear breaks loose, people get rattled like dice in a cup, but there's no time to be stunned. Within moments, British troops are moving. A young officer, Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, leads the charge across the bridge. The German guards are caught off balance. The fight is sharp and fast. In just a few minutes, the bridge is in British hands, and Brotheridge goes down, shot during the assault. He becomes one of the first Allied soldiers killed in action on D-Day, in the first key ground fight of the invasion, taking a bridge to protect the landing force. That moment almost never exists in the American movie version of D-Day, but in the real timeline, it's central. Not long after, a German officer nearby hears the firing. He recognizes what it is. Airborne troops. Not a raid. Not just bombing. The invasion is underway, and the bridges are already being grabbed. He pushes for permission to counterattack immediately. He doesn't get it. German command is still trying to confirm if Normandy is the main blow or a diversion. Some leaders hesitate, worried about committing armor too early. Orders are delayed. Time leaks away. By dawn, British airborne units in the area are dug in and organized. They take other points. They secure key ground. They prepare for the big question. When German armor finally moves, can they stop it? Because at some point, the Germans have to respond. And on D-Day, there is one major armored counterattack that really matters. Not at Omaha, not at Utah. Against the British sector, as morning turns into midday, German tanks and armored troops from the 21st Panzer Division finally go in, driving toward the area that threatens the invasion's eastern side, toward those bridges and the airborne positions. That counterattack hits men who have been awake forever, paratroopers and glider troops who landed in the night, fought at dawn, and are now holding ground that can't be surrendered. They're outnumbered, they're under heavy pressure, and they hold anyway. German reports afterward don't describe the airborne troops as disorganized or panicked. They describe them as disciplined, coordinated, like regular infantry, dug into every strong point, farmhouses turned into hard positions. Fire controlled, defense layered. By nightfall on June 6th, that eastern flank is still in Allied hands, and that matters more than people realize. Because if German armor had broken through there early, it could have rolled toward the beaches and squeezed the landing zones from the side. Instead, the hinge holds. Now the sun is up. The beaches are hot, and the story that's usually treated like the whole thing, Omaha, was only one part of a larger plan that was working. Let's talk about one of the British landings that rarely gets a spotlight: Gold Beach. Early morning, British infantry hit the sand, and it's not like there are no Germans there. Elements of the same German formations causing disaster on Omaha are present in parts of this sector too. The British know that going in. They plan for it. And one of the biggest differences is armor timing. The British launch amphibious Sherman tanks, DD tanks, far enough out to swim in, but not so far that most of them sink. A large number reach the shore and start firing before the infantry is fully exposed. That changes everything, because at Omaha, American DD tanks were launched too far out in brutal conditions, and many never made it. That left infantry hitting the beach with far less armored support, under direct fire. At Gold, the approach looks more like a system executing a drill, teams moving in sections, covering each other, working lanes through obstacles. Not flashy, not heroic speeches, just method. And method wins minutes. Minutes save lives. Minutes decide whether you get pinned down on the sand or you break through and get inland. By mid-morning, British units at Gold are pushing off the beach and moving toward their first inland objectives. Casualties are heavy. War is war, but the assault isn't stuck on the waterline. German officers watching these moves notice a difference in style. They don't call the British braver. They call them harder to stop because they move like a machine, one group firing while another moves and another prepares to push again. That same method shows up again on Sword Beach. Sword is supposed to help drive the fight toward Caen. It's not just land and survive, it's land and push. And here's another detail Hollywood tends to skip. By 1944, the British have built specialized assault vehicles for this exact kind of fight. Mine-clearing tanks, tanks modified to smash obstacles, tanks designed to attack bunkers at close range. A lot of that innovation comes from earlier hard lessons, like the 1942 raid at Dieppe, a disaster that taught the Allies what not to do when attacking a defended coast. Those lessons get paid for in blood and then used to save lives later. On Sword, British infantry hits the beach with that specialized support behind them. They grind through defenses, push inland, and begin moving toward the day's big goal. Meanwhile, another piece clicks into place. Commandos come in and push to link up with the airborne troops holding those bridges. By early afternoon, those forces connect. The invasion's eastern side is not floating loose. It's stitched together. But even with all that, the biggest British objective of Day 1, Caen, doesn't fall on June 6th, not even close. The British push toward it, get within range, and then the fight hardens. German forces throw everything they can to hold that city and the ground around it. And then, later in the day, that armored counterattack pressure returns. German armor hits British forward positions, expecting to drive them back into the sea. But the British don't break. They call in naval gunfire when needed. They hold key ground. The counterattack loses momentum and pulls back. By nightfall, the reality is this: the British and Canadian beaches are functioning beachheads. The eastern flank is secured by airborne troops who took those bridges in the dark and held under armor pressure. And the invasion, as a whole, is still alive, still expanding, still moving inland, which raises the real question. If that's the shape of the day, why do most people only remember one beach? And why did the German side, who fought the entire invasion, keep pointing to British professionalism as the bigger threat? That's where we go next. By the end of June 6, 1944, the invasion wasn't one beach trying to survive. It was a 5-beach operation that was, overall, doing what it was designed to do: get ashore, get organized, push inland, and hold long enough for the follow-on waves to turn a landing into a foothold. And that's what makes the modern memory so weird, because the movie memory of D-Day is basically one story made universal. Omaha is real. Omaha was brutal. Omaha deserves to be remembered exactly as it happened. Men stuck in open sand under machine gun fire, small groups improvising, officers and NCOs trying to build order out of chaos, and ordinary soldiers doing things that still sound impossible. But Omaha wasn't the whole invasion. It was one sector of a much bigger machine, with different terrain, different defenses, different outcomes, and different nations carrying huge pieces of the plan. Here's the most painful part. A lot of American soldiers at Omaha didn't even know the full picture in the moment. Some veterans later said they felt like they were the invasion, like if they failed, everything failed. And you can understand why they felt that way. When you're pinned down under fire, you don't have a wide map view. You have your patch of sand, your buddy next to you, and the next 10 feet you're trying to take. But the larger truth is this: they were not alone. While Omaha was fighting for its life, British and Canadian forces to the east were already establishing beachheads and moving inland. Airborne troops on the eastern flank had already taken key crossings in the dark and held them against the main German armored counterpunch of the day. That's not an insult to Omaha. It's the opposite. It means Omaha's sacrifice was part of a combined operation that worked, an allied system that held together under the worst possible stress. So when Hollywood turns Omaha into D-Day, it doesn't just shrink British and Canadian contributions. It also shrinks the truth of what the American soldiers were part of, a coordinated assault where the whole design mattered. Now ask the question you're probably thinking. If the British and Canadians landed in bigger numbers, secured key flanks, and fought off the major armor response on D-Day, why did so many people grow up with a version where they barely exist? To understand the erasure, you have to look at something that sounds cold, but runs war like an engine. German threat assessment. German defenses weren't built on vibes. They weren't built on movie logic. They were built on who the Germans believed would hit hardest, where the biggest objectives were, and which Allied formations had the most experience. By 1944, Germany had been fighting the British Empire and Commonwealth for years, since 1939. British units had fought in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Italy. They'd had time to learn, time to adapt, time to build doctrine, and time to produce specialized tools for exactly the kind of job Normandy required. American forces, by comparison, were growing fast into a massive war machine. Numbers, industry, logistics, air power, shipping. But many American ground units landing on D-Day were relatively new to combat at that scale. That's not a character judgment. It's a timeline. And German commanders knew the timeline. That's why, on D-Day, the German armored response you always hear about, the famous tank counterattack, was pointed toward the sector tied to Caen and the eastern flank. Not because the Germans thought Americans were weak, because they feared competence. This is something you see again and again in how German officers described what they faced. When they talked about American units, they often emphasized courage, stubbornness, and sheer volume. Men who kept coming. When they talked about British units, they often emphasized method, order under fire, steady movement, controlled aggression, the feeling that the assault was being executed like a plan, not like a desperate gamble. And if you're defending a fortified line, that difference matters. Bravery can sometimes be blunted with fire and chaos. Method is harder to disrupt because method keeps functioning even when the situation turns ugly. That's why British assault doctrine on the beaches mattered so much. By 1944, British forces had learned painful lessons about attacking defended coasts, especially after disasters earlier in the war. Those lessons got turned into planning, engineering, and specialized vehicles built to crack obstacles, clear mines, and burn out bunkers. So when British infantry hit places like Gold and Sword, they weren't relying on luck. They were relying on a system, infantry, armor, engineers, and naval gunfire working in one rhythm. And that system is a big reason 3 British and Canadian beaches didn't become 3 Omahas. Again, this does not diminish Omaha. It explains why the invasion as a whole held together even when one sector became a nightmare. Now here's where the pop culture problem gets deeper, because even if you accept that D-Day had 5 beaches, you might still assume the real action was all American. But D-Day's first critical ground combat, minutes after midnight, wasn't American at all. It was British airborne and glider troops taking and holding the crossings over the canal and river on the eastern edge of the invasion. That work did 2 things at once. It protected the invasion's flank. It forced German armor to fight for access instead of racing freely toward the beaches. That's not a side quest. That's structural. It's one of the reasons the Germans couldn't just pour reinforcements into the beachhead from the east on day 1. Now look at what most people remember from the biggest modern D-Day movie. You remember American paratroopers scattered across the countryside, Men dropped off target, regrouping in confusion, fighting small fights, doing brave things to get the mission done. That's a real story too. The American airborne drop was chaotic and costly in places, and they still accomplished key tasks through grit and initiative. But here's what's missing from the mainstream memory: the British airborne story of the eastern flank. Gliders landing in darkness on a razor-thin schedule, the bridges secured in minutes, and the armored counterattack being absorbed and stalled. That isn't extra. That's the hinge of the day. So why didn't it become the universal image of D-Day? Because history has two versions. There's the recorded version, archives, unit histories, operational reports, battle maps, after-action summaries, museums, and cemeteries. And then there's the remembered version, the one most people carry around in their heads. The remembered version isn't built by footnotes. It's built by stories that feel personal, visual, and emotionally satisfying. And Hollywood is very, very good at that. If you're an American studio making a wait-woo epic for a primarily American audience, the economic incentive is obvious. Tell an American-centered story with American heroes. Not because anyone sits in a dark room plotting to erase allies. Because movies are expensive, studios chase what sells, and audiences connect fastest to stories that mirror them. That's market gravity. And market gravity is strong enough to reshape what millions of people think really happened, even when historians have been clear for decades. That's why a single beach, Omaha, can become shorthand for the whole invasion. That's why 5 beaches turn into 2 in the public imagination. And that's why 83,000 British and Canadian troops can become a blurry footnote in the minds of people who aren't reading the documents. This isn't just a film debate. It affects memory. When popular culture becomes a teacher, emotion beats statistics almost every time. If a teenager learns D-Day from a 3-hour movie, that movie becomes the truth-feeling version. It sticks. And if the movie doesn't show British and Canadian sectors in any real depth, a lot of viewers never absorbed that those sectors were the majority of the landings on day one. What's even more unsettling is that this isn't only an American problem. Over the years, surveys and classroom discussions in Britain have shown that many students still overestimate how American-only D-Day was, even when they're learning it at home. That's the power of the bigger cultural megaphone. So when the last veterans pass away, and that is happening fast, the gap gets worse, because living memory is the strongest correction we have. When a veteran can say, "I was there," that's not the whole picture. It forces the conversation to widen. But when the veterans are gone, the film version becomes harder to challenge, because it's the most vivid thing left. And here's where this begins to shape something bigger than a history lesson. If a country grows up believing it did the key jobs alone, it can start to think it should lead alone. It can undervalue alliances. It can ignore hard-won lessons from partners. It can build a myth of superiority that's based less on reality and more on what played best on screen. That kind of myth doesn't just disrespect British and Canadian service. It also disrespects American service because it forces American courage to carry a false story it doesn't need. The men at Omaha don't need anyone else erased to make their sacrifice meaningful. Their story stands on its own. And D-Day's real power comes from the combined truth. Multiple nations, multiple sectors, one coordinated plan, all of it under pressure, all of it necessary. Now, to be fair, this narrower movie vision wasn't always the default. Earlier big D-Day films were imperfect too, but they at least tried to show scope. Multiple beaches, multiple nations, multiple missions. They showed that the invasion was bigger than one American lens. Later films with better realism and tighter focus often narrowed that lens. The result is a strange trade. More intense authenticity for one slice of the invasion, but less accuracy about the invasion as a whole. And that trade has consequences, because when the lens narrows, the supporting cast disappears. The British and Canadian landings disappear. The specialized doctrine disappears. The midnight glider assault disappears. The fact that the main armored counterattack collided with the British sector disappears. And the public memory starts to think the invasion was basically America hit the beach and won the day. But Germany didn't see it that way. German records, whether wartime assessments or post-war recollections, show that the defenders understood the invasion as a combined force with different strengths. The Americans brought numbers, shipping power, industry, and logistics that made the invasion possible at that scale. The British and Canadians brought hard-earned amphibious experience, refined tactics, and specialized solutions developed through years of war. Put those together, and you get the thing Germany couldn't stop. That is D-Day's real lesson. Not one nation's greatness, but an alliance executing a plan under fire. Now there's one more place where you can feel this mismatch between history and memory. Go to Normandy today and you'll see it. There are sites tied to the first shots of the day and the first key objectives: bridges, museums, original equipment preserved, names listed, unit insignia, and detailed plaques explaining exactly what happened. You can walk across the bridge the glider troops took in the dark, Pegasus Bridge, still standing as a physical reminder that D-Day began before sunrise, and that it began with British troops locking down the eastern flank. You can visit Canadian and British memorials that make it impossible to pretend those landings were minor. And then you can drive to Omaha, which you'll recognize instantly, because Omaha is the beach the world has been shown 1,000 times. That's the asymmetry in one road trip. Some stories told endlessly, other stories told once, quietly, to people who already came looking. And the question we're left with isn't, was the movie wrong? The movie captured something real. The question is, what did we lose when one story swallowed the whole operation? Because when you erase the British and Canadian role, you erase the full mechanism of victory. You erase how the flanks were secured, how doctrine reduced chaos, how specialized equipment and hard lessons shaped outcomes, how German decision-making reacted to perceived threats. You erase how alliances actually win wars. And if you erase that, you're not just forgetting names, you're forgetting how history really works. In Part 3, we're going to bring this home, down to the names, the places, and the hard evidence that still sits in archives and on the ground in Normandy. And we're going to answer the biggest question of all, why the enemy remembered the British and Canadians so clearly, even when popular culture didn't. By now, the pattern is clear. The public D-Day most people can describe from memory is Omaha Beach, one nightmare, one American-centered lens that feels like the whole day. But the real invasion was bigger, messier, and honestly more impressive than any single film could hold. 5 beaches, 3 nations, roughly 156,000 troops landed on June 6, 1944. And the part that keeps getting lost isn't a tiny footnote. It's the fact that British and Canadian forces made up the larger share of the day's landings, about 83,000. And they did critical jobs that shaped whether the beachhead lived or died. So if we want to pin down what was erased, we have to do 2 things. First, return to what the German side recorded and believed. Second, return to what still exists today, on the ground, in unit histories, and in the graves of the men who didn't come home. Let's start with the Germans again, because they had no reason to flatter the enemy. German defensive thinking in 1944 wasn't built around fairness. It was built around threat. If you're defending a coastline and you know you can't be strong everywhere, you decide where the most dangerous blow will fall and you stack strength there. German assessments in the months leading up to D-Day focused hard on the sector tied to Caen, the area British and Canadian forces were tasked to push toward from Sword, Juno, and parts of Gold. Caen mattered because it was a gateway inland. Roads and rail lines converged around it. The Germans understood that if the Allies got Caen quickly, the invasion would accelerate. And that's why, on D-Day itself, the only major armored counterattack that developed in a meaningful way, the thrust involving the 21st Panzer Division, was oriented toward the British sector tied to Caen and the eastern flank. The German leadership's decision-making was also shaped by a factor that Hollywood rarely talks about because it's not cinematic: experience. By June 1944, British and Commonwealth forces had been fighting Germany since 1939. They'd fought across multiple theaters. They'd been through failure and adaptation. They'd refined amphibious doctrine the hard way and built specialized equipment to make it work. American forces brought enormous power, numbers, logistics, air superiority, shipping capacity, industry. Without American strength, you don't get Normandy at that scale. But on June 6th itself, many American ground units landing at Omaha and Utah were comparatively new to large-scale combat against Germans in Western Europe. That doesn't mean better or worse. It means different. And German officers described that difference with different words. When they talked about Americans, they often emphasized courage and stubbornness. Men who kept coming, who fought hard, who improvised and pushed through. When they talked about British forces, they often emphasized method, controlled movement, coordinated action, and a professional feel that was harder to disrupt. That's the key. Bravery alone can get trapped on a beach. Method gets off the beach. Method is why British and Canadian assaults on Gold, Juno, Wader, and Sword could take shape quickly enough to form functioning beachheads, while the disaster on Omaha became the symbol of D-Day in popular memory. Now, I want to say something carefully, because this is where people get defensive. None of this is anti-American, it's pro-truth. Omaha was extraordinary courage under the worst conditions. That story should never be minimized. What should be corrected is the idea that Omaha equals D-Day. Omaha was one part of D-Day, and D-Day only becomes fully understandable when you include what happened on the British and Canadian sectors, and what happened even earlier in the dark. Because D-Day didn't begin with the first ramp dropping at sunrise. It began when gliders, silent, engineless, with no second chance, came down near the bridges on the invasion's eastern edge. Those bridges had to be taken fast and held. If they weren't, German armor could have struck the flank, cut through, and endangered the landing zones. That is why the glider assault was so central. British airborne and glider troops didn't just cause trouble, they protected the invasion's structure. And when the German armored response finally moved, it didn't roll straight into the beaches. It collided with that structure, those airborne positions holding the crossings and the ground around them. That's why the eastern flank remained sealed by nightfall on June 6th. That's why German reinforcements from the east didn't just pour into the beachhead. That's why the invasion could keep building momentum while Omaha was still trying to breathe. Now, if you want to feel the cultural erasure in a single sentence, here it is. Most people can describe the film version of Omaha in detail, but they can't name one British or Canadian D-Day objective, one British or Canadian unit, or one British or Canadian action from that day. Not because the actions didn't happen, because they weren't marketed into memory. And that's where the story becomes more than a film critique. It becomes about how modern people learn history. If your main history teacher is cinema, you don't get a balanced view. You get the most emotionally gripping slice of the story. That slice becomes the truth-feeling version, and everything else becomes background noise. It's not a conspiracy, it's economics. Studios spend huge money. They aim at the biggest audience. They build a narrative around the audience's identity, and the version that sells becomes the version people repeat. That's why a generation can grow up thinking D-Day was basically Americans stormed the beaches and everyone else helped in the background. That's why even in places that should remember differently, the Hollywood version still wins. Because a powerful story told 1,000 times beats a correct story told once. Now look at the human cost of that. Not just in pride or politics, but in personal memory. In Britain, you had veterans who showed up decades later. Older men standing in rain with medals on their jackets, watching D-Day anniversaries become media events. Some watched modern D-Day movies and didn't see themselves, not in a petty way, not in a give me credit way, in a quiet, unsettling way, because they knew they were there. They knew what they did mattered. And the popular story acted like they were invisible, and they weren't invisible on June 6th. On June 6th, British and Canadian forces weren't some extras. They were on 3 out of 5 beaches. They were pushing inland by nightfall. They were tied to the hard fight for Caen. They were supporting the link-up with airborne troops on the eastern flank, and they faced the main armored counterpressure the Germans could throw on day 1. So what happens when those men fade from living memory? Soon, no one will be left who can say, I landed at Sword, or I took Juno, or I held near the Orne, with the authority of lived experience. When that happens, the last correction disappears. And then, the only version many people know will be the movie version. A version where 156,000 becomes 73,000. A version where 5 beaches become 2. a version where the flanks that made the plan survivable don't exist. And here's the deeper danger. When nations build their identity on simplified war stories, it shapes how they think about themselves in the present. If Americans are taught implicitly for decades that America essentially won D-Day alone, it feeds a broader myth that America always wins alone, that partners are optional, that alliances are nice but not necessary. That myth can harden into arrogance, and arrogance is historically expensive. But the truth is more serious and more useful. Alliances win wars. Doctrine matters. Preparation matters. Experience matters. And on D-Day, the Allies didn't win because one nation was uniquely heroic. They won because the combined force executed an operation of massive complexity under fire. Now, let's bring it down to the ground. Literally, if you go to Normandy today, the evidence is not subtle. You can stand at the sites connected to British airborne actions and see how physically close those objectives were to the invasion's survival. You can visit the bridge associated with that first crucial seizure, still preserved, still marked, with a museum nearby, and artifacts that make the timeline real. You can find the remains of fortifications on British and Canadian beaches. You can find plaques and memorials listing units and names. You can find cemeteries that don't care about movie narratives, just dates and headstones. And those names matter because history isn't just numbers, it's people. Men who died on June 6th in places the public rarely hears about. Men who lived through June 6th and fought through Normandy afterward. Men who carried the war forward from the beaches into the hedgerows, into the towns, into the grinding months that followed. The popular story often stops at the landing. But for most soldiers, D-Day was the opening act. Normandy was a campaign. Caen became a long, brutal fight. The hedgerow country became its own kind of hell. And the Allied advance across France required constant pressure, constant logistics, constant adaptation. British and Canadian formations that landed on June 6th were not tourists. They were in the fight for months afterward, pushing through some of the hardest terrain and strongest German resistance in the campaign. So here's the point of this whole story, why it matters beyond the scorecard of who got the most screen time, because correcting the memory doesn't reduce anyone else. It completes the picture. It lets Omaha be what it was, an American ordeal of courage and loss, without forcing it to carry a false burden of being the whole invasion. It lets Utah be what it was, successful and important, with its own complications and surprises. It lets Gold, Juno, and Sword be what they were, hard landings executed with system and experience, forming beachheads that helped the invasion survive its worst stress. It lets the airborne story be what it was, flank security that shaped everything. And it lets the German perspective be what it was, an enemy trying to allocate defenses based on competence and threat, not movie stereotypes. Now, if you want a final image to hold on to, one that fights the Hollywood version without insulting it, use this. D-Day was a machine with 5 gears. Omaha was 1 gear grinding, sparking, nearly breaking. Utah was another gear turning more smoothly than expected. Gold, Juno, and Sword were 3 more gears biting into the coast, building momentum and holding enough ground to make the whole machine keep moving. And the airborne actions on the flanks were like the bolts holding the frame together so the gears didn't fly apart. That is how the invasion survived, not by one nation's story replacing all others, but by an alliance doing what alliances do best, bringing different strengths to one plan. So the next time someone says, D-Day was Omaha, you don't have to argue, just widen the frame. 5 beaches, 3 nations, 156,000 men. And on that day, about 83,000 British and Canadian troops landed too, fought too, bled too, won too. History recorded them. The ground still remembers. The only question is whether we do.